In 1855, two men stood on opposite sides of a granite mountain in western Massachusetts and made a promise that should not have been possible. Thomas Doane, a quiet surveyor from Cape Cod, and Herman Haupt, a West Point engineer from Philadelphia, told the state of Massachusetts they could bore a railroad straight through 4¾ miles of Berkshire granite. 20 years later, on a cold February morning in 1875, the first steam locomotive ran straight under that mountain, from North Adams to the Deerfield Valley. And when the surveyors checked their work, they found the two headings had met with an error of 9/16 of an inch. Not 9/16 of a foot, 9/16 of an inch, across nearly 5 miles of solid rock. That is the story I want to tell you today. I have been reading the old construction ledgers of the Hoosac Tunnel for weeks now, and I keep coming back to two men. The first is Thomas Doane. He was born September 20, 1821, in Orleans, Massachusetts, a small fishing village on the elbow of Cape Cod. His father ran a small academy, and Thomas studied at Phillips Academy in Andover before apprenticing for 3 years in the engineering office of Samuel Felton in Charlestown. Doane was a careful man. He measured twice. He spoke softly. He carried a leather notebook with him into the field, and the entries in that notebook were so precise that other engineers borrowed his sightlines for years after he left a project. When the Hoosac Board appointed him chief engineer in 1863, he was 41 years old, and he had never failed a survey in his life. If you care about the men who built this country with their hands, the workers nobody ever wrote a book about, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. Hit the button. Come back. The second man is Herman Haupt. He was born March 26, 1817, in Philadelphia. He graduated from West Point in 1835 at the age of 18, then resigned his Army commission almost immediately to enter the railroad trade. He worked the Horseshoe Curve and the Gallatin Tunnels in the Allegheny Mountains for the Pennsylvania Railroad. He served as General Superintendent of the Pennsylvania from 1849 to 1851. When Massachusetts hired him in 1856 to take over the Hoosac project, Haupt was 39 years old, already the most respected tunnel engineer in the United States, and he was about to lose his fortune to a mountain that did not care about his reputation. Both men knew what they were walking into. The Hoosac Range was not soft sedimentary rock. It was Precambrian gneiss, granite, and mica schist, some of the oldest and hardest stone on the continent. Above the line of the bore, the mountain rose more than 1,700 feet of solid rock. Above the central shaft, the overburden alone was over 1,000 feet. The longest railroad tunnel in the United States at that moment was less than a mile. Doane and Haupt were promising to build something nearly 5 times longer through stone that European engineers had said could not be cut by any tool then known. What neither man knew in 1855 was that the rock itself was a lie. Edward Hitchcock, the state geologist of Massachusetts, had walked the surface of the Hoosac Range with a hammer in 1851 and told the legislature the stone was uniform hard gneiss from portal to portal. No test borings were taken. Hitchcock had guessed from outcrops. Inside the mountain, the truth turned out to be far more cruel. The east end was dense gneiss, as advertised. The center, near the line of the central shaft, was the hardest stone of all, a granite so tight that hand drills shattered against it. And the west end, near North Adams, was a band of crumbling, water-saturated rock the workers came to call porridge stone, a material so soft and so saturated that the men complained it was like trying to build a sandcastle in the mud. Hitchcock had been wrong about almost everything. The men with hammers paid the cost of the mistake. Let me tell you how the work began. In 1851, Edward Hitchcock, the state geologist of Massachusetts, walked the Hoosac Range with a hammer and a notebook, and he reported back to the legislature that the mountain could be pierced. The state authorized a credit of $2 million. Edward Serrell took the first contract in 1854. Serrell brought a strange machine to the east portal, a steam-driven, boring engine that was supposed to chew the rock like a giant wood plane. The machine worked for exactly 10 feet of tunnel before it seized solid in the granite and stopped forever. Workmen called it the elephant. They left it where it stood and picked up their hand drills. When Herman Haupt took over in 1856, he found the east heading less than 70 feet inside the mountain. He fired Searle's crew, brought in his own teams, and went back to the oldest method known to mining. 2 men with steel drills and a sledgehammer. One man held the drill against the rock face. The other swung the hammer. Between each blow, the holder turned the drill a quarter turn so the cutting edge would bite fresh stone. They worked in pairs for 8 hours at a stretch, and a good pair could sink a single hole about 1 foot deep in 1 hour. When they had a row of holes drilled, they packed them with black powder, ran a slow fuse, and ran themselves to a safe distance. The blast threw maybe 2 cubic yards of rock onto the floor. Then the muckers came in with shovels and wheelbarrows and carried the rock out by hand to the dump pile outside the portal. I have run the numbers 3 different ways. In the best month under hand drilling and black powder, Haupt's crews advanced the east heading about 50 feet. 50 feet a month against a tunnel that needed to run 25,081 feet from portal to portal. At that rate, the Hoosac would take more than 40 years to finish. Haupt knew this. Doane, when he arrived later, knew it too. Both men understood that the only way the tunnel would ever be cut was if the work itself got faster. So here's the question I keep asking the old ledgers. How do you triple the speed of a job that has not changed in 1,000 years? The answer that came out of the Hoosac Tunnel changed mining forever, and it came from a machine shop in Fitchburg, Massachusetts. Charles Burleigh was a mechanical engineer at the Putnam Machine Works in Fitchburg. He was born in 1824, and he had spent his career taking other men's bad ideas and making them work. In 1865, he turned his attention to an old European problem, the compressed air rock drill. French and Italian engineers had been trying for years to make a pneumatic drill that could survive the punishment of cutting hard rock. None of their designs lasted more than a few hours in the field before the cylinders cracked or the valves jammed. Burleigh redesigned the entire mechanism. He used heavier cast iron, simpler valves, and a piston stroke timed for the harder American granites. His drill weighed 372 pounds. It was clumsy, it leaked air, it had to be carried into the heading on a wooden frame mounted to a portable carriage, but it worked. In June of 1866, the Burleigh drill was carried into the east heading of the Hoosac Tunnel for its first field trial. The first run was rough. The drills broke down often. The compressed air pipes leaked at the joints. By November, Burleigh and his crew had redesigned the weak parts, and the second generation of the drill went into the heading and stayed there. On the east side of the mountain, a wooden, water-powered compressor house pumped air to 65 pounds per square inch through 2 8-inch cast iron pipes that ran a quarter mile into the bore. The Burleigh drill bit into the granite at a rate the hand drillers could not match. Quick pause. If these stories matter to you, I am putting them into a series of books. The men nobody wrote a book about, the ones who built this country with their hands. Volume 1 is out now. Scan the code on your screen or click the link in the description. Then come back, because what happened next is the part most people never hear. The numbers tell the story. Before the Burleigh, the best month at the east heading was about 50 feet of advance. After the Burleigh was running smoothly, the advance climbed to roughly 150 feet a month. That is a 3-fold increase, one not by working the men harder, but by changing the tool in their hands. For the men holding hammers, the change was bigger than that. A drill that used to take them an hour now drilled itself in 15 minutes. They were freed to load powder, set fuses, muck the broken rock, and turn the next round. The Burleigh drill did not replace them. It multiplied them. But the Burleigh alone was not enough. Black powder, the old mining explosive, was too slow and too weak for the deep holes the Burleigh could now drill. Doane and his consulting engineers needed something stronger. They turned to a new chemical that had recently arrived in America from Sweden by way of the Swedish chemist Alfred Nobel. Nitroglycerin. Nitroglycerin was a beautiful, terrifying liquid. A few drops could shatter a steel anvil. A small bottle could turn a freight wagon into a hole in the ground. American railroads had been refusing to ship it because too many cars had vanished in mysterious explosions along the line. And here, in a small chemistry shop in North Adams, Massachusetts, a single immigrant chemist was about to take that liquid and turn it into the most powerful blasting agent the United States had ever seen. His name was George Mowbray. He was born May 15, 1815, in Lewes, England. He studied chemistry in England, France, and Germany, then immigrated to New York in 1858 and became a naturalized American citizen. He spent years in the oil fields near Titusville, Pennsylvania, using nitroglycerin to shoot dead oil wells back into production. When the post-war oil depression of 1866 broke his refinery, Mowbray moved to North Adams and offered his services to the Hoosac Tunnel. In 1867, Thomas Doane accepted. Mowbray built a small nitroglycerin works on a wooded ridge near the west portal, far enough from any house to limit a worst-case loss. He developed his own method for making what he called tri-nitroglycerin, a more purified form of the liquid that he believed would handle more predictably. Over the life of the project, his works produced more than 500,000 pounds of explosive for the bore. The story I want to tell you about Mowbray is the story of a sled and a snowstorm. One winter morning in 1868, a teamster was hauling a load of nitroglycerin in glass jars down the wagon road from the works to the west portal. The sled hit a rut and overturned, and the jars went rolling into a snowbank. Every man on the road expected the entire valley to go up. Nothing happened. The jars sat in the snow for hours, and when Mowbray came down to inspect them, he found the liquid had frozen solid. He took the frozen jars back to his laboratory, thawed them in warm water, and tested the contents. The chemistry was unchanged. The frozen nitroglycerin was completely inert. Once thawed and detonated, it worked exactly as before. Mowbray had discovered, by accident, that frozen nitroglycerin could be transported safely. From that morning on, every shipment from the North Adams works went out frozen. Workers in the tunnel thawed the charges in heated water baths just before loading them into the drill holes. The accident rate dropped. The pace of work climbed again. Mowbray also worked out the electric blasting cap. Before the Hoosac, miners had detonated blasting charges with slow-burning fuses. The man who lit the fuse had to run for safety while the spark crept down a length of cord toward the charge. Misfires were common. So were premature detonations. Mowbray and his shop developed a small copper cap filled with mercury fulminate that fired the nitroglycerin charge on an electric current carried in a thin wire from a hand-cranked magneto at a safe distance. Crews could now load a full round of 20 or 30 holes, run a single wire out of the heading, and fire them all at once on the turn of the crank. The pace of work increased again. The Hoosac Tunnel was the first major American civil project to fire its charges by electricity, and the technique spread quickly to the mines and quarries of the Appalachians. Every modern blasting cap in use today is the great-grandchild of the cap that Mowbray and Doane fired into the Hoosac Granite in 1868. By 1868, the east and west headings of the Hoosac were both moving at a steady pace under Burleigh drills and Mowbray's frozen nitroglycerin. A typical round at the heading went like this. The Burleigh drill cut a pattern of holes in the rock face, usually 24 to 30 holes arranged in a circle. Each hole was about 1.25 inches wide and 4 to 6 feet deep. The workers withdrew the drill, loaded each hole with a measured charge of nitroglycerin in a paper or copper cartridge. Charges range from 6 pounds at the lighter end to 50 pounds at the heavier end, depending on the rock and the depth of the round. They connected the charges with electric blasting wire, ran the wire to a safe distance, and fired the entire round with an electric detonator. The blast threw 5 to 8 cubic yards of rock onto the floor. The crews mucked out the rubble, advanced the timbering, and the drill came back in for the next round. Day shift, night shift, year after year, against 4 miles of granite. The West Portal was a separate war altogether. When the crews first cut into the mountain at the North Adams end, they ran straight into the porridge stone that Hitchcock had never warned anyone about. The rock face wept water. The roof of the bore sagged within hours of being cut. On October 3, 1869, 6 inches of rain fell on the Hoosac in a single afternoon. A small brook above the line of the tunnel overflowed its bed, found a crack in the porridge stone, and poured straight down into the west heading, filling it with water, sand, and broken rock for hundreds of feet. The workers spent weeks digging out what the storm had buried. To hold the west portal open at all, the engineers had to wall the bore with a brick arch. Brick yards opened in North Adams to keep the masons supplied. Crews of bricklayers worked alongside the drillers, building a circular tube of brick 6 to 8 courses thick that ran from the portal more than 7,000 feet into the mountain. Over the life of the project, the masons laid more than 20 million bricks. The lining was so heavy and so dense that more than a century later, freight trains still ride under the same arch the original masons set in mortar in the 1870s. The brick lining is, in its own quiet way, as remarkable as the bore itself, because the men who laid it could not see beyond the lantern light, could not stand upright in some sections, and worked through dripping water that ran from the roof onto their hands all night long. The workforce that did all of this came from the immigrant lines of the eastern ports. 800 to 900 men worked the tunnel at the peak of construction. Most were experienced hard rock miners from Cornwall in southwest England, men who had grown up cutting tin from the Cornish granite and who knew how to handle a drill underground. They worked alongside Irish and German immigrants, Danish and French Canadian laborers, and a small number of native New Englanders. The crews ran 3 shifts of 8 hours around the clock. 750 men were on the rolls at any one time, with shift changes at 6 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, and 10 at night. They lived in boarding houses in Florida and North Adams, in shacks along the wagon roads above the central shaft, and in temporary railside dormitories built by the contractors. They were paid weekly. They drank in the saloons of North Adams on Saturday night, and they were back at the heading by Monday morning. The Hoosac Project was the steady work of an entire generation of mining men in western Massachusetts, and the small towns on either side of the range still carry the family names of the men who came. Quick pause. If these stories matter to you, join the Boss tier for $4.99 a month. Loyalty badge, custom emoji, early access 24 hours before public, and members-only polls. Link in the description. Now back to it. But the headings from the east and west portals were not enough. Doane had calculated, correctly, that a tunnel nearly 5 miles long could not be ventilated by the portals alone. The smoke from a single steam locomotive would suffocate the next train coming through. He proposed a third attack on the mountain, sunk straight down from the surface to the line of the bore. The central shaft. Work on the central shaft began in 1863, under Doane's direct supervision. The shaft was 27 feet long by 15 feet wide. The plan was to sink it more than 1,000 feet straight down through the heart of the Hoosac Range until it intersected the tunnel grade. From the bottom of that shaft, 2 new headings could be driven east and west to meet the headings advancing from the portals. The central shaft would also serve as the permanent ventilation chimney of the finished tunnel, carrying steam and smoke straight up to open air at the top of the mountain. Sinking the shaft was its own slow war. Workers on the surface ran a steam-powered hoisting engine that lowered an iron bucket on a wire cable into the shaft and pulled it back up loaded with broken rock. The walls had to be lined with timber as the shaft went down to keep the rock from spalling onto the men below. The deeper the shaft went, the more water seeped in from the surrounding rock. Pumps ran around the clock to keep the bottom of the shaft from flooding. By 1867, the shaft was 583 feet deep, more than half the planned depth, with 13 men working day shift at the bottom. The work on that shaft was unlike anything else on the project. The men descended in a wooden bucket lit by a single oil lamp, a 5-minute drop into the darkness with the cable singing above their heads. At the bottom, they worked on a wet floor of broken rock under a ceiling that grew higher with every blast. The air was cold and heavy. The smoke of the blasts hung in the shaft for hours because there was no through draft to clear it. The men ate their dinner in the hoist bucket on the ride to the surface. They were paid extra for the danger of the shaft work, a fact the surface crews resented and the shaft crews never forgot. Doane spent more time on that shaft than on any other part of the project. He went down the bucket himself almost weekly to inspect the work, walk the center line, and check the alignment marks his survey crews had transferred to the rock. What happened next is the moment the tunnel earned the name it has carried ever since. The Bloody Pit. October 17, 1867, was a cold Saturday morning. Just after noon, 13 men descended in the bucket to the bottom of the shaft to begin the afternoon round. Above them, on the surface, the hoisting house and the pump house and the gasometer that fed the lamps all stood together in a cluster of wooden buildings around the shaft head. A candle was burning in the gasometer house. A leak of naphtha gas drifted near the open flame. The gas ignited. The flame jumped to the supply of explosives stored above ground. The hoisting house caught fire. The wooden frame of the head structure collapsed. Burning timbers, iron fittings, hoist parts, and the great iron bucket itself fell 583 feet straight down the open shaft, onto the 13 men working below. The pumps were destroyed in the same fire. Water began to rise in the shaft from the broken seeps in the rock. The men on the surface fought the fire for hours. By nightfall, the head was a heap of charred timber. The shaft was a chimney full of smoke. There was no way to lower another bucket, no way to reach the men below. In the days that followed, the workers on the surface dropped a heavy weight on a long rope down the shaft, trying to sound for life. They thought they heard hammering. Other men listened and thought they heard nothing. The decision was made to seal the shaft to smother any remaining fire, then to rebuild the head structure and the hoist before any rescue attempt could begin. It was a year before any worker reached the bottom of that shaft again. When the rescue party finally descended, in October of 1868, they found the bodies of the 13 men. They also found a crude wooden raft built by hand at the bottom of the shaft from broken timbers, evidence that some of the men had survived for hours or days after the initial blast and had tried to keep themselves above the rising water before the air gave out. I will not give you a count of the lost in this video. The official ledger of the Hoosac records every man who died on that bore, and the marker that stands on the green in the town of Florida, Massachusetts, today carries those names. Anyone who walks the green and stops at that stone can read them. I have been to North Adams. I have stood at the West Portal. The men who built this tunnel are honored where they fell, and they are honored here every time the bore is talked about with care. The central shaft fire stopped the tunnel work for almost a year. When the new hoisting house was built and the new pumps were running and the water had been drawn down to the working level, the sinking of the shaft began again. The shaft reached its final depth of 1,028 feet on August 13, 1870. From that depth, new crews began driving headings east and west under Doan's resurveyed line. This is the moment to tell you about the alignment work, because what Doan did on the surface of the Hoosac Range above that shaft is the part of this story that other engineers still talk about 150 years later. The problem Doan faced was this. There were now 6 separate faces of excavation. 2 headings advancing from the east portal toward the center. 2 headings advancing from the west portal toward the center. 2 headings advancing from the central shaft, 1 east and 1 west. All 6 headings had to meet, perfectly, on the line and grade of a tunnel running straight under more than 1,000 feet of rock. There was no way to see from one heading to another. There was no satellite, no laser, no global positioning. Doan had a brass surveyor's transit, a steel chain, a plumb bob, and his notebook. His solution was elegant. He built 6 wooden survey towers on the highest peaks of the Hoosac Range, each tower lined up with the planned route of the tunnel below. From the top of each tower, a surveyor sighted through a transit straight along the line to the next tower. Down at the portal of the tunnel, a second surveyor sighted upward at the tower above, transferred the line into the bore by lowering a plumb bob from the tunnel ceiling, and marked the center line of the heading on the rock face with chalk and string. Doan and his crew rebuilt those sight lines and rechecked them every few weeks. When the central shaft was sunk, he ran the line down the shaft on a heavy plumb bob hung from a wooden frame at the top, and he transferred the same surface line to the bottom of the shaft so that the 2 new headings could be driven along the correct azimuth. The mathematics behind it was 19th century trigonometry, handwritten in pencil in Doan's leather notebook. The instruments were the best brass transits available from the workshops of New York, but they were still hand instruments. The men on the towers held the sight lines on cold mornings and in summer rain. They corrected for the curvature of the Earth over a baseline of nearly 5 miles. They corrected for the heat of the sun on the metal of the transit. They corrected for the sag of a plumb bob string in a deep shaft. They were doing, by hand, the work that modern tunnel engineers now do with laser theodolites and computer software, and they were doing it across a longer baseline than almost any tunnel built before. When the central shaft headings drove east and west and met the headings coming from the portals, the surveyors checked the closing point with chains and transits. The east heading from the central shaft met the heading coming up from the east portal on December 12, 1870. The west heading from the central shaft met the heading coming from the west portal in November of 1873. Across more than 4 miles of straight bore, through 6 separate faces, the closing error of the alignment was 9/16 of an inch. To put that number in context, that is the thickness of a thumbnail across a line longer than the deck of an aircraft carrier. Some modern engineers who have studied the Hoosac survey say no hard rock tunnel built since by hand methods has matched that accuracy. Doane himself was not there to see the final hole through. By 1869, his contract with the state had ended, and the bondholders sent him west. He took a job in Nebraska, building 240 miles of railroad on the extension of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy. He laid out and named nearly all the towns along that line. One of them, a small farming town in eastern Nebraska, kept the name Doane in his honor. Doane College, today Doane University, was founded in that town and named for him. He returned to the Hoosac project in 1873 as consulting engineer, just in time to walk the finished bore. Herman Haupt, the man who had taken the first contract back in 1856, was long gone from the tunnel by then. He had pushed the east heading more than 4,250 feet into the mountain before the state government, lobbied by the rival Western Railroad, cut his funding in 1861. Haupt poured his own money into the project, trying to keep it alive. He went bankrupt. He left the Hoosac and went south, where the Civil War was just beginning. President Abraham Lincoln appointed him Chief of the United States Military Railroads in 1862. Haupt rebuilt bridges and rail lines for the Union Army for 2 years, then returned to private engineering after the war. He died in Jersey City on December 14, 1905, at the age of 88, still remembered as one of the great railroad engineers of his century. The men who finished the tunnel were the Shanley brothers, Walter and Francis, 2 Canadian civil engineers from Ireland who took the final contract in December of 1868 for $4,594,268. Walter Shanley was born October 11, 1817. Francis was born October 29, 1820. They had built the Welland Canal in Canada, and they understood big stone work. They took on the Hoosac when no American contractor would touch it. The Shanleys pushed the work hard for 5 years. Their teams used Burleigh drills, Mowbray's nitroglycerin, electric blasting caps, and steam-powered hoists, all the new tools that the first half of the project had invented one at a time. They closed the bore on Thanksgiving Day, 1873, when the last 16 feet of rock between the west portal heading and the central shaft heading was blasted away. The men in the west heading and the men in the central shaft heading had been listening to each other's drills for weeks. When the final round was loaded and fired, the smoke cleared and the lantern light from one side shone through to the other for the first time in 20 years. The workers stepped through, shook hands in the lantern light, and the bore was closed end to end. The first train ran through the tunnel on February 9, 1875, almost 20 years after the first contract was signed. Stand for a moment with me at the east portal of the Hoosac Tunnel on the afternoon of February 9, 1875. A locomotive named the N.C. Munson sits on the iron with its boiler hot and its bell ringing. Thomas Doane is at the controls. He was the man who laid the line. He was the man who built the towers. He was the man who taught Mowbray where to put the nitroglycerin works and showed the masons where to spring the brick arch of the lining. He climbs into the cab. The engineer eases the throttle forward. Steam hisses up into the cold February air. The locomotive moves into the granite, and the iron rails carry it under more than 1,700 feet of rock for almost 5 straight miles, and out the west portal into the town of North Adams, where the people who have lived 20 years with the sound of blasting under their mountains stand along the line and cheer. The bore had cost about $21 million in 1875 money, 10 times the original estimate. It had taken about 20 years from the first contract to the first train. It had broken Herman Haupt and 3 contractors before it was done. It had cost the lives of every man whose name is written on the stone in Florida, Massachusetts, and we honor them by name. It had also given American engineering 3 tools it would carry into every later tunnel, every later mine, every later canal. The Burleigh pneumatic drill, the industrial use of nitroglycerin, the electric blasting cap. Those 3 tools went west on the next generation of railroads. The men who finished the Hoosac took them to Colorado for the silver mines of Leadville. They took them to Nevada for the deep workings of the Comstock lode. They took them to the Pennsylvania anthracite coalfields. By 1880, every major hard rock mine in the United States was running compressed air drills and electric blasting caps. The Hoosac was the proving ground. Charles Burleigh died in 1883, his drills by then standard equipment in mines on 3 continents. George Mowbray died in 1891, his frozen transport method still in use for handling dynamite shipments. Walter Shanley served in the Canadian Parliament after the Hoosac. Francis Shanley died in 1882. Every man on this project carried what he learned at the Hoosac into the rest of his career, and the rest of his career carried the Hoosac methods into the rest of American industry. Thomas Doane lived to see his tunnel run trains daily for 22 more years. He died at West Townsend, Vermont on October 22, 1897, at the age of 76, while visiting friends. He was buried in Orleans, the Cape Cod village where he was born. The town of Doane in Nebraska still stands. Doane University still stands. The bore he aligned to within 9/16 of an inch still carries freight trains every day under the Berkshires. Herman Haupt lived 8 years longer. He died December 14, 1905, in Jersey City, after a long career of railroad consulting work that took him from the Allegheny Mountains to the canal locks of the Mississippi. His name appears on the bronze plaque inside the old Central Shaft Head house at the top of the Hoosac Range as the first chief engineer of the bore. The man who started the work outlived everyone who said it could not be done. I have walked the Hoosac. I have stood at the West Portal in North Adams on a cold morning in November and watched a freight train come out of the mountain at speed, the headlight cutting through the steam, the iron wheels singing on the rail. I have climbed up the side of the range and looked down at the stone benches where Doane's survey towers once stood. The towers themselves are long gone, taken down once the bore was finished, but the stone bases are still there in the woods, 6 of them in a perfectly straight line across the top of the mountain, exactly where his notebook said they had to be. This is not a story about modern engineers or modern machines. It is a story about hand survey, hand drilling, hand chemistry, hand alignment, 4 3/4 miles long, 20 years deep. The Hoosac Tunnel is still in service. The same bore that Doane and Burleigh and Mowbray and the Shanleys finished in 1875 carries freight under the Berkshires every day in 2026. Pan Am Southern runs the line now. The Granite has not moved. The closing error has not changed. The men who built it are not coming back, but the work they did is still standing. Every shift, every train, every season. If you live in western Massachusetts, drive out to the green in the town of Florida and stand at the marker stone. Read the names. Walk down to the East Portal. Listen for the trains. That is the honor these men earned, and that is the honor we owe them. One more thing before you go. Every name I find, every number, every record, I am collecting it all into a series of books so these men are not forgotten again. Volume 1 is available right now. Scan the code on your screen or follow the link in the description. See you in the next one.